Hi angels, my name is Jess, and this video is something that's been a long time in the making, to say the least. So, needless to say, I am very excited to finally be sharing this video with you all. Also, this video literally wouldn't exist without the sources I used, so please check them out down below if you're interested in learning more about this subject. Let's get into the video. As a plus size gal myself, I know how hard it is to find cute, comfortable underwear, which is why I'm really excited for the sponsor of today's video, Parade, who I just so happen to have a really good discount code for, so if you're interested, please keep watching. If you're not already familiar with Parade, they're an inclusive female-owned brand that makes sustainable and affordable bras, bralettes, swimsuits, underwear, you name it. And Parade is my absolute favorite for underwear because not only do they fit me well, but they are so soft and don't constrain my chest or stomach at all. And as someone who carries their weight in their stomach, that is a big accomplishment to achieve. This particular set is one of my favorites. Like, I cannot stress enough how soft it is. It's from their Lush Rib collection, and I'm wearing the boys short and scoop bralette, but there's so many different styles and colors to choose from. But let me show you what else I got in my Parade order this month. My other favorite from Parade is their new cotton collection. I keep repeating how soft and comfortable these sets are, but it's just because it flabbergasts me every time. And I'm not really a bra person, at all. I don't own any bras, I only wear bralettes, and I do not wear them daily. But these bralettes, I could get used to. Call me crazy, but I think these bralettes would make really cute tops with a pair of baggy jorts or even wearing a Parade set under a sheer lace dress. Yeah, you're gonna catch me wearing these sets all summer long. Okay, up next we have this insanely adorable silky mesh number from Parade, and when I put this on for the first time, I literally lost my mind. It's very coquette and so romantic. I cannot wait to take cute pictures in this set this summer. I feel like I should be lying in a bed of flowers or sipping tea by the seaside somewhere. And last but definitely not least, Parade recently launched a swim line that I am absolutely obsessed with. I'm wearing the triangle bikini top and high-rise breeze from their Eco Splash collection, which is made from recycled plastic bottles. I love this green color so much, and it matches my room so well. I only wish I could go swimming in here. And like I mentioned earlier, I do have a code for you all. You can use JB50 for 50% off your order, and that's bigger than any sale happening on Parade's website right now. So this is the biggest discount you can get currently, JB50 for 50% off your Parade order. Get in there, get your absolute steal, grab yourself a cozy set for those hot summer days indoors, or a sexy little set that makes you feel like the hottest being on earth. Have some fun, get your pieces, and thank you to Parade for sponsoring today's video.
Before we begin, I do want to give a brief content warning for discussions of fat phobia, racism, xenophobia, and drug addiction.
The earliest information I could find in my research goes back to the late 1800s and early 1900s with the creation of stoutwear or outsize clothing, which are just earlier terms used for plus size. According to Dr. Carmen Keist, who, to brag a lot, used to be my fashion professor, and Dr. Sarah Marchetti, plus-size women in the 1920s were called a variety of names by the popular and fashion press, including large-figured, full-figured, well-developed, the Juno figure, fleshy woman, inclined to rounding curves, stately figure, mature/matronly figure, heavy, extra size, generous proportions, unfortunate proportions, portly person, not so slender, big woman, chubby figure, woman of dignity, and stout. I'd be here until 2060 if I went over every single one of those terms, so I'm going to stick to expanding on stoutwear and outsize clothing just to clarify what they actually mean, since I'm going to be using them quite a bit throughout this video. A New York Times article from January 1917 defines stout as a figure of matronly appearance with generous bust, back, and hip curves that did not fit in at all with fashion's demands as to what the stylish figure should be. However, stout usually describes a woman with a bust 38 inches and over, since this was the term used by manufacturers and retailers during the period studied. Similarly, as written by Riley Martin, outsized clothing made for women with hips between 42 and 60-inch hips became available to English women in the early 20th century, but continued to serve as a site of contention and frustration long after that period. Rhetoric describing outsized clothing in England during the 1920s to the 1960s was critical of the unfortunate women who could not fit into the few standardized sizing options available. Advertisements, magazines, and newspaper articles from this period indicate that while regulating the fat male body was not a concern, controlling the fat female body was. So, as we can see, not a lot has changed in the last 60 to 100 years. In the 1800s, being fat or stout was usually equated with health and wealth. This may or may not be a shocker, but in the 1880s, being fat was more highly sought after and was seen as a part of the ideal beauty standard. However, as I'm sure most of us know by now, this obviously changed. By 1890, the Gibson girl, which was the personification of the feminine ideal of physical attractiveness as illustrated by Charles Dana Gibson, partly contributed to the voluptuous woman becoming unfashionable. The new ideal woman's figure included a full bosom, a nipped-in waist, and slender legs. Roundness was discouraged. Another thing that heavily contributed to the villainization of fatness was xenophobia and racism. As written by Dr. Carmen Keist, this conception changed during the late 1800s and early 1900s when slenderness became fashionable. Historian Katharina Vester argued that this shift partially occurred because of the influx of large populations of poor, fat, and unfashionable immigrants from Europe. Extra weight was also seen as un-American and negatively associated with immigrants. Women immigrant bodies were often uncorseted due to the nature of their work, which made their bodies larger and were thus considered uncontrollable and unrestrained. To assimilate into American culture and not be seen as the other, many immigrants felt pressure to conform to the ideal slender image through dieting and apparel choices. To give some context for the extent to which fat phobia persisted in the early 20th century, fat women, or the fat lady, were literally a part of freak show spectacles. I really hate using the term freak show because they were just horrible and exploitative spectacles created for rich white people and allowed them to be very fat phobic and ableist and racist, but that could be a whole video on its own. For instance, Brooklyn's 685-pound fat lady, Jolly Mabel, was reported in the New York Times to have had a booming laugh that shook Manhattan skyscrapers. These shows would have photos of fat women displayed with taglines like, "She's so fat that it takes 7 men to hug her," or "Holy smokes, she's fat. She's awful fat." Which is so disgusting and dehumanizing, it literally makes me want to throw hands. But I think this really does highlight how anti-fatness often leads to the dehumanization of fat people, and how much the media and the general public often displayed this sense of fat people aren't real people, but rather something for us to laugh and gawk and shake our heads at. As it became more and more obvious to retailers that fat women weren't going anywhere, the first exclusively plus-size store opened in 1904. Lena Bryant, or as I'm sure most of us know her as, Lane Bryant, was very skilled in altering mass-produced pieces and creating her own custom lingerie, although she did originally begin by making maternity clothes. Lena was a poor Lithuanian-born widow that used her talents as a seamstress to edge her way into the garment trade of early 1900s New York. She rented an apartment with her sister-in-law, and with the sewing machine she made a down payment on, began making custom lingerie and alterations to mass-produce shirtwaists and skirts. A few years later, she opened her first storefront at 1489 Fifth Avenue and actually went on to make fashion history by creating the first maternity dress. I'm also using the term first very loosely here. In 1909, Bryant married Albert Malson, a mechanical engineer that came up with the idea to swap fitted belts with convertible elastic waistbands to allow the garment to grow with women's bodies. Talking about maternity was viewed as a social faux pas in the early 20th century, so Lena wasn't really able to advertise her maternity business explicitly beyond word of mouth. In May 1911, Albert registered a patent for a garment with one expandable waistband and actually explicitly mentioned stout women. My present invention relates to maternity dresses and other garments which are contrived and adapted to accommodate themselves to persons of different sizes and shapes. The object of the invention primarily is to so construct the waistband or waist portion of the garment that it will adjust itself easily and naturally to persons of different sizes without the necessity of altering its length or shape. In the accompanying drawings illustrating my invention, Figure 1 illustrates a view of my improved waistband device as adapted to be worn by a slender person. Figure 2 is a similar view of the same device showing it applied for use by a stouter person. In 1914, Albert was granted the patent, and the rest was history. In 1916, Lane Bryant incorporated and appeared on the New York Stock Exchange, and by 1917, Lane Bryant's sales had surpassed $1 million for the first time. By the 1920s, Lane Bryant sold a wide range of women's products, such as undergarments and outerwear for plus-size women. I do just want to note that clothing solely dedicated to fat women was super uncommon at this time. Plus-size women often relied on tailors, dressmakers, or their own sewing skills in order to make clothes that actually fit them. It wasn't until the 1920s when plus-size women could buy ready-to-wear clothing from various specialty retailers, which included the stores Lane Bryant, R&Z Stout Waists, and Graceline Dresses. And even with the creation of these plus-size clothes, it was by no means an act of body inclusivity or fat acceptance. In fact, a lot of these stoutwear retailers emphasized the idea that their clothing pieces were scientifically designed to improve the look of the plus-size woman and to make her appear more slender, yet still in the vein of popular styles and silhouettes. Ready-to-wear clothing is quite literally what it sounds like. Clothing that's ready to wear. It might seem obvious or wild given this day and age of Shein, Urban Outfitters, and literally having an entire internet at our fingertips. But historically, each garment of clothing was made individually. Rather than buying a piece of clothing off the rack or ordering it online, you'd typically make your own clothes and wear those garments for a very long time. Poorer people, servants, and laborers would often wear hand-me-downs or bought used clothing. So although these plus-size clothes existed and were being marketed to fat women, they were still being created and sold to consumers with the idea that if you wear these clothes, they'll make you look thinner and thus more appealing. This was especially evident through advertisements such as one from Lane Bryant that emphasized their clothing would make plus-size women appear slender and smaller, as well as express individuality and make stoutness becoming. Magazines like Vogue really emphasized the idea that stout women should wear designs that hid their bodies and sort of camouflage them into looking more slender, with a quote from Vogue stating, "Plus-size women cannot gown themselves in the same styles as their exceptionally slender friends." These garments, designed to hide fat women's bodies, did so through the use of fabric additions and optical illusions. Fabric additions included pleats, flares, draperies, floating panels, sashes, apron backs with bows, and the use of jabots. Optical illusions in the creation of plus-size clothing included the use of diagonal lines and diagonal trimmings, as well as flared skirts and sleeves finished with extra fabric and decorations, such as fluting, rows of buttons, and wide-shaped cuffs. And of course, it was also very much encouraged that plus-size clothing be made with primarily darker or concealing colors, such as black, browns, and dark blues. Now, why does that sound kind of familiar? The early 1900s was the era of department stores, which by the 1920s began advertising clothing made specifically for plus-size women, thus leading to the infamous separation between straight-size clothing and plus-size clothing. And of course, with separate departments comes separate styles, as well as charging more for plus-size garments, which, honestly, most of us are no stranger to these days. I also feel the strong urge to include this quote from Dr. Keiss and Dr. Marchetti, mostly because it makes me kind of angry, but also because I do think it's really interesting. The New York Times urged hats for plus-size women with correct lines and proper colors. It was deemed ridiculous for a plus-size woman to wear tiny hats incongruous with the size of her body. Flattering hat styles were said to be those with moderate-sized brims, those with slightly drooping brims, and those with large soft crowns. Vogue advised plus-size women to avoid the popular bob hairstyle because long hair concealed thick necks. If all else failed, scarves were kind for hiding unsightly double chins. Shoes for the plus-sized were to be plain with buckles and without the fashionable straps recommended for the slim. Monochromatic stockings and shoes would help make the ankles and feet appear thinner. Feeling grateful that I don't have to worry about incongruous hat sizes and whether or not my ankles and feet look slim. And of course, corsets were super popular undergarments
for
hundreds of years, and the 1920s were no different for fat women. There was this idea that bodies could be easily shaped into a figure that's most desirable, with Vogue stating that flesh is plastic and can be molded to look its best with very little guidance. I want to say it feels insane that so much thought was put into how we can make fat women look thinner, but it's really not that surprising given that a lot of these fashion ideas or fashion rules are still forced onto fat women today. There's still very much this widely held belief that all fat people are potentially thin people if only we had enough self-control and discipline, which is obviously complete bull poop. Sorry guys, I'm trying to stay advertiser friendly. But I will literally scream it from the rooftops. Clothes are meant to fit bodies. Bodies are not meant to fit the clothes. Similar to today, a popular belief in the early 20th century was that there weren't enough fat women to financially justify carrying plus sizes. Slowly but surely, magazines and clothing companies came to realize that fat women were a lucrative target market that had been ignored for basically ever. As so eloquently explained by Dr. Lauren Downing Peters, the stoutwear evolution, as it were, was founded on the idea that the conventions of standard size, mass-produced garments were inadequate, imprecise in fit, and exclusionary, and by consequence rendered fat women fashion outsiders. As such, stoutwear entrepreneurs proposed a wholesale renegotiation of prevailing sizing conventions, but also of the industry's approach to dealing with the problem of the stout woman by placing her needs at the very center of their attention. In doing so, the discourse of stoutwear homed in on the matter of fit, perhaps to the neglect of fashion. Which is to say that the focus of plus-size fashions were mostly on the fit of the garments, thereby ignoring the fashionability of the garment, which, as any fat person knows, literally still happens today. And also happens in the reverse, like some brands focus so much on the fashionability and cheapness that they don't care about the fit of the garment. Even though manufacturers were finally making clothes that fit some fat people, this clothing was produced with the intent of making fat people look thinner. Designers became very preoccupied with optical illusions and lines that would make fat people look thin, since fatness was still viewed as something negative and anti-fashion. This particular quote is very interesting to me because it's just another example of how we've been regurgitating the same boring and arbitrary fashion rules for literally over a century. Speaking in similar terms about how design elements could be employed to keep the eye moving around the figure and thereby not lingering on an errant curve or bulge, it described the horizontal stripes on another ensemble as causing the eye to be led rhythmically up and down and crosswise as the eye travels from stripe to stripe, to again exaggerate the wearer's apparent height and reduce her overall width.
No matter where you are, everyone is always connected.
And this wasn't even the beginning of the immense fat phobia that would occur over the next 100 years. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I always suggest Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Sabrina Strings. In the 1920s, illustrations of flappers often featured elongated limbs and skimpy dresses, and after reviewing 1920s fashion periodicals, past researchers concluded that editors and advertisers constructed thinness as a key component of the idealized female gender role, thus making a thinner body be deemed as more desirable than a heavier one. I think it's really important to note that a lot of the fashion for fat women that these retailers, manufacturers, and writers were aiming at were typically white and upper to middle class fat women. As written by Dr. Peters in her dissertation, in situating stoutwear as a uniquely and explicitly American industry, however, this dissertation does not claim that the discourses of stoutwear and stoutwear itself, i.e. garments, were accessible to and affected all fat women in the same way. Indeed, the stout body as it was discursively constructed in the fashion media and specifically within the discourses of stoutwear was, first and foremost, a
American
body. However, it was also a white, middle-class, heterosexual body and was a body that was deeply embedded within and shaped by conventions and expectations of normative white femininity, a fact which underscores the fact that fashion ultimately is a white discourse or one which constructs and upholds a white Anglo-Saxon ideal of feminine beauty. Indeed, throughout the course of my research, I looked for but did not find non-white bodies within the discourses of stoutwear. In fact, I found no black bodies of size within the women's and fashion press, nor did I encounter conversations surrounding the black woman's sartorial needs in general until 1945 when Ebony was first published, and later in Jet, which was founded in 1951. Fat black women and women of color were very much ignored when it came to a lot of aspects of everyday life because of how extremely racist the United States was and still is, and fashion was no different, which I hate to say isn't very shocking because of how much fat black women and women of color are still ignored by the fashion industry today. I also tried finding articles that focused on plus-size black women's fashion throughout history, but the most helpful article I could find summarizes Patricia Hunt Hearst's entry in the second edition of Black Women in America, an historical encyclopedia. I'll list the link to the article below as well as a link to where the book can be purchased. This in no way systematically changes or erases the immense fat phobia and racism that exists within the fashion industry. But here's some plus-size black and non-black people of color that are genuinely amazing and you should definitely be following on social media. I'll put all the links to their Instagrams in my description, and of course, please feel free to leave the ats of your faves in the comments. It was surprisingly difficult to find any good information on plus-size clothing from the 1930s to 1950s, but I became much less surprised once I learned that the stoutwear industry actually began to decrease in 1929. In 1939, women's wear discontinued their Styles for Larger Women section that gave weekly hot gossip about the stoutwear industry, which they attributed to overall decline in stoutwear manufacturing. Some people attributed it to the difficulties in adapting to the new decade of fashion trends, including higher waistlines, fitted hips, and princess-cut silhouettes, while others attributed this decline to changing beauty standards and the fact that it was no longer fashionable to be fat. While stoutwear manufacturers did continue to make stoutwear in the 1930s and beyond, they did so under a different name. For instance, Lane Bryant shifted from stoutwear to junior plenty and chubby garments in the 1940s and 50s. I do want to clarify that during the 20th century, it was never fashionable to be fat, but there was a significant cultural shift in the 1920s and 1930s of what was considered beautiful and acceptable. There were obviously many factors to this, with two of the great ones being the Great Depression and World War II, which led the beauty standards of the 1930s and 40s to become a lot leaner. As Caroline Reynolds Milbank wrote, for the first part of the 1930s, figures were almost emaciated and therefore clothes were narrow, long, and spare, or simple to the extreme. Not to bombard you guys with quotes, but I do think that Lauren Downing Peters explained this shift very well. Within this context, and specifically with regard to fashion, fatness had gone from being a burden that would be variously hidden or reshaped through dress to being utterly intolerable as the rift between fat and thin grew ever wider. As the science of obesity was growing progressively sophisticated, and as more drugs and cures emerged to combat fat, overweight people found themselves increasingly scrutinized, scorned, and stigmatized in the 1930s and beyond. Fashion would persist as a medium to mitigate the visible stigma of fatness. However, the modernist and comparatively hands-off preoccupation camouflage and optical illusion would be replaced by more forceless methods for affecting a slender appearance, namely the elasticized girdle, that would again forcefully mold the fat woman's flesh into something approximating the fashion ideal. So there was a big shift from the 1920s where the focus was on making fat people look thinner to the 1930s where it was seen as completely unacceptable to be fat to begin with. I found a blog that was nice enough to post photos from a 1940s clothing catalog that actually included plus sizes, which I think is really interesting. The author notes, this collection of dresses from 1943 are all in plain colors, common during the war years: navy, black, wine red, pine green, and sailor blue. Darker solid colors are a slimming color palette, as well as a certain design features such as pleats. All of the skirts on these dresses have long pleat lines down the front. Here the pleats don't add volume, but instead add vertical lines, which aids in the slimming effect. Even in winter, plus-size clothing was not only in dark colors. These cheerful house dresses, also from 1943, come in medium blue, mauve, wine, and medium green. The prints, long stripes, and small repeating florals are flattering on any body shape. Trim is minimal and usually of the same fabric, yet another trick of the eye. Whereas Mrs. dresses had more contrast piping and buttons, stout dresses blended trim with the print. The effect was a streamlined look and also frugal during hard times. In summer, colors naturally must get lighter, and so it was with these cotton dresses in larger women's sizes: brown, green, blue, and my favorite, aqua with white dots or flowers. The same technique of long lines in the skirts and minimal contrasting trim still applies in 1947. I find it super interesting that even during World War II, there was an emphasis on making silhouettes and pleats that tried to make women look thinner, which really goes to show you that even war cannot stop rampant fat phobia. Anyways, moving on to the 1950s, there were many different factors to women's clothing in the 1950s, including appropriate lining, flowy silhouettes, slimming skirts, slimmer sleeves, slim waistlines, and darker prints and colors. According to Jennifer Kleist, the 1950s dresses for plus-size women stayed clear of horizontal lines. They had vertical or twisted lines and designs as well as slim positioning. They had silhouettes that were elegant and fluid with different tubular forms, giving the illusion of being draped on the body. The 1950s plus-size dresses had a simple, relaxed fit, since a tight-fitted dress can cause the body to look bigger. The plus-size skirts were plain, line-flowing, never narrow or tight. They were worn long enough to relieve the impact of broad thighs and with some convenient wholeness at the bottom to lend grace to walking and supporting the body. The coat-style dress of the 50s took the emphasis away from the wide shape of the profile and divided the distance into the vertical regions. The pencil skirts were fine as long as they hung straight or flourished at the bottom. Circle skirts were always beautiful and attractive for all types of frames. The 1950s slimming dresses had sleeves cut to the preference and provided a thinning impact when properly designed. When stretched to the wrist in simple fit or with a few inches over the elbow, they appeared to conceal the scale of the broad forearm. Large, loose sleeves continued to expand the body. Strong upper arms can never be completely displayed in the evening dress, but partly protected with rolled sleeves or a delicate scarf. Fully covered arms were also a standard slimming procedure for the plus-size ladies. Seeking retro sleeve dresses was quite a task in the day. Wearing a cardigan jumper over clothing was also a great option back in the 50s. The 1950s plus-size fashion had darker tones that were sometimes softer and gray, cooler variations, and some that were bright warm, based on the degree of firmness, texture, and disposition. Complexion and hair color have a lot to do with choosing the color of the dress. However, it is a well-known fact that darker colors such as black make a person look thinner, and this trick was used by the 1950s designers as well. Prints that are broadly spaced and in high contrast draw exposure to size. Therefore, the designers of the 50s selected smaller prints, not very vibrant ones. They also used shades that were not conflicting. For example, tiny dot print is more likely to appear nicer on a plus-sized woman. So, as you can see, a lot of consideration was taken into how designers can make plus-size clothes that would make women appear smaller and thinner than they actually were, which, if you're fat or you've been paying attention to this video at all, isn't very shocking. Quick side note, but the word used for fat children in the 1950s was literally chubbies, and I just need all of you to know that. I know they definitely did not mean that in a positive way, but it's kind of cute. I don't know, like, chubbies. It's giving something.
The food you eat usually controls your figure.
The 1960s was the decade of revolutions: the civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War protests, environmentalism, the sexual revolution, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, and the fat acceptance movement was no different. Just to give a brief recap, one of the first fat acceptance events occurred in 1967 in Central Park, which was later dubbed a Fat-In, and it consisted of a group of about 500 people eating ice cream and burning photos of Twiggy, Sophia Loren, and diet books. In 1969, the National Association to Aid Fat Americans was founded by William J. Fabre in response to the discrimination that his fat wife experienced. In 1972, the feminist group The Fat Underground was formed. It started as a radical chapter of the NAAFA and was founded by Sarah Fishman and Judy Freespirit. The Fat Underground took issue with the growing bias against fat people in the scientific community and coined the phrase, "A diet is a cure that doesn't work for a disease that doesn't exist." which is pretty based if you ask me. There were many criticisms of the NAAFA during that time, the first being their fat activists were mostly middle and upper class white women, and the movement didn't do much to recruit or appeal to people of color, men, and poor people. And even though the group mostly consisted of women, the NAAFA did not have a feminist or gendered response to fat oppression and excluded lesbians for a long time. I'll leave a bunch of links below where you can read more about this, but let's get back to the fashion. It was actually pretty difficult to find information about plus-size women's fashion in the 1960s, but I did find an interesting paper about plus-size English women in the 60s. As someone who grew up fat and was pushed into the role of the mom friend quite a bit, I'm not really surprised that there's a preconceived connection between being a plus-size woman and a matronly figure, mostly because a lot of fat women are still pushed into this motherly role today. Caroline Combs, in her 1966 The Sunday Times article, wrote that finally manufacturers are aware that plus-size women do not want to look like matronly hippopotami with crossed-over bodices and fussy drapes. I also found an interesting connection between fat phobia and misogyny and capitalism in 1960s Britain. As noted by Riley Martin, while some manufacturers changed outside styles to make them more modern and fashionable, the idea that an outsized woman had matronly features remained embedded in the way stores discussed large sizes. In 1968, the Daily Telegraph reported on Evans, a prominent and successful outsized clothing store. The author of the article noted that in the eyes of Evans, the word fat doesn't exist, stout is out, outsize is not exactly overstressed. Rather, the choice would be motherly. Motherly. Cyril Spencer, the head of Evans, defended this word choice and argued that mothers want to be attractive but don't have too much spare money to throw around. In other words, outsized women are relegated to the status of overweight mothers. The characterization of outsized women as motherly during this decade forms a part of the return to traditional gender norms in the face of rising unemployment and anxiety about blurred gender lines in 1960s Britain. Although it's hard to find much information, I'm absolutely sure this also applies to the United States. Honestly, finding any information on plus-size fashion in the 1960s and 70s is weirdly difficult, but I guess it's partly due to fat phobia and the fact that few places wanted to actually show or discuss plus-size fashions, but it could also be a record-keeping issue. I actually found an eBay listing for a 1960 Lane Bryant spring and summer catalog that gave me most of the information I could find on 1960s plus-size fashion. Some popular styles included A-line dresses, kitten heels, high-waisted pants, capris, corsets and shapewear shorts, button-up blouses, and bouncy midi skirts. In 1972, the NAAFA held a call for plus-size models for their annual convention, and their fashion show was the first documented fashion show of its kind. In 1979, Mary Duffy, one of the first plus-size models, bought a startup agency, immediately added petites, and created Big Beauty / Little Women, the first agency in the world to specialize in plus-size models and petites. Once again, I could not find any information on plus-size styles in the 1970s, so I'm going to assume that they were pretty similar to straight-size clothing and included garments like bell-bottom pants, midi skirts, maxi dresses, peasant blouses, button-ups, turtlenecks, etc. I may be very wrong, but I have no choice but to assume since the internet acts like fat women didn't exist in the 1970s. Moving on. 1980s plus-size fashion also included shoulder pads, bulky long sweaters, permed hair, dropped waists, high-waisted pants, cardigans, fleece sweaters, midi dresses, fit and flare skirts, striped sweaters, and plaid print. In 1980, Marina Rinaldi launched, which was one of the first high-end clothing brands for plus-size women. Around this time, a plus-size chain named Forgotten Woman. That name is a little too on the nose. Forgotten Woman had about 30 stores across the US until the chain filed for bankruptcy and closed in 1999. It actually wasn't until the 1980s when the term plus size became a more popular descriptor for women sizes 14 and up. Something that I found in my research that I think is very interesting is that between 1986 and 1988, American Vogue ran a series of advertorials called Fashion Plus, which documented the mid-1980s rise of designer-led plus-size fashion. No longer was a plus-size woman, to borrow the words of Samantha Murray, to be regarded as sexually unattractive, unclean, unhealthy, unintelligent, and unwilling to change. treated with suspicion and often with quite unabashed hatred and disgust, or as a symbol of abject lack of control. Rather, as Fashion Plus declared, the plus-size woman of the mid-1980s had reclaimed the terms of her embodiment, stepping into the fashion spotlight by choosing to be beautiful. She was active and intelligent, fabulous and fascinating, demanding and discrimination, and above all else, fit for the pages of Vogue. The late 80s and early 90s marked the beginning of the heroin chic era. For those of you who don't know, heroin chic is a style characterized by pale skin, emaciated features, dark circles under the eyes, androgyny, and stringy hair, with the aim of giving a sickly-looking vibe, as the goal is to basically look like you're addicted to heroin. I don't want to delve too much into heroin chic since I've talked a lot about it before in my previous videos, but I do just want to say that creating an entire fashion style around addiction is clearly very horrible and exploitative, especially since it was mostly poor people and people of color that were experiencing the devastating effects of the opioid crisis. That's not to say that rich people did not suffer with addiction, because Kate Moss and Jamie King were literally the poster childs of the heroin chic vibe in the 90s, and both of them have struggled a lot with addiction, but it's just clearly a very classist and racist thing to make very trendy, and I don't know, it's kind of on brand for rich people, I guess. I keep saying this, but it was very difficult to find any information about plus-size fashion in the 90s. The most helpful article I found was about Mode magazine, which I'm pissed doesn't still exist, and I think Rachel Lubitz summarized it best. Imagine this, an issue of Vogue with a plus-size model front and center on the cover. Inside there are only ads featuring plus-size women. The editorials, which are shot in exotic locations, are filled with plus-size women as well. Ads are from designers and brands that cater to women who are size 12 or larger. In a time when heroin chic and slim-hipped androgyny was all the rage in fashion, a single plus-size focus magazine called Mode was shaking things up, boosting the careers of not only plus-size models, but also plus-size brands and designers. Mode started in 1997 and has been likened to being the plus-size version of Vogue. The magazine was created by Nancy Lewinter and Julie LeWitt Nierenberg, two fashion industry veterans and close friends who worked for magazines like Vogue, Esquire, Harper's Bazaar, Mademoiselle, and Marie Claire. To really cement their status as a reputable magazine, the founders knew that their first cover, which debuted 20 years ago in 1997, had to be perfect. Lewinter and LeWitt Nierenberg didn't pick an in-demand plus-size model like M, Kate Dillon, or Natalie Laughlin. They picked a relatively unknown woman and had her laughing, wearing a bright yellow jacket. She had just put on some fabulous clothes, and she just threw her head back and was so excited because normally as a plus-size model, she was relegated to very old-fashioned clothes, Lewinter said. She just started laughing. That's when we realized this magazine wasn't about fashion, but validation and empowerment and lightening up. It was like this revolution that was starting for women who had never been told that they looked great or that they could look great. Queen Latifah even graced the cover of Mode, and eventually the magazine's circulation grew to 600,000 with 10 issues a year. Mode became so popular that when it asked Versace to design plus-size garments for its editorials, Versace bit. The same Versace that had just created a safety pin dress for Elizabeth Hurley wanted to do plus sizes because Mode asked. Neiman Marcus agreed to sell Versace in plus sizes too. Versace doing plus, I mean, it was unthinkable, Lewinter said. That, unsurprisingly, but very unfortunately, did not last long, as Versace, Valentino, and other designers stopped producing the clothing which Mode relied upon, which caused major issues in both their fashion department wardrobes and their advertising revenue. Very unfortunately, Mode closed in 2001 after September 11th Freedom Publications, who had backed 50% of the company, didn't want to be in New York and thus backed out of Mode. Mode financially couldn't sustain itself and published their last issue in October 2001. I actually already have a video about fat phobia and the lack of fashion inclusivity in the early 2000s, which you can watch here. I'd repeat my main points, but it just feels a little redundant. As someone who was a plus-size teenager throughout the 2010s, I can confidently say that the plus-size fashion options absolutely sucked. I was really into Tumblr, and I'd reblog all these cute, grunge outfits, knowing that I could never find those pieces in my size because my only options were Forever 21, Torrid, ASOS Curve, Lane Bryant, and Avenue. And honestly, Lane Bryant and Avenue did not have young enough styles for middle school me, and Torrid and ASOS were too expensive, so most of the time I would just settle for Forever 21 and whatever I could find at Goodwill. Like, I fully remember the absolute chokehold peplum tops and skinny jeans had on me, not because I necessarily thought they were cute, but it just felt like those were the only styles that, like, the Forever 21 plus size section had. Some popular styles in the early 2010s included colored skinny jeans, skater skirts, the twee aesthetic, Jeffrey Campbell Lita boots, statement necklaces, Oxfords, galaxy print, neon, and so much more. Like, I could literally sit here all night reading all the fashion trends from the 2010s, but let's just say most of them were not the best. I will say that plus size clothing options expanded a lot in the late 2010s, with a lot more brands carrying plus sizes in trendier clothing styles than ever before. Now in 2023, there's a lot of large companies that carry plus sizes like Target, Universal Standard, and Good American. But there's also a lot of smaller brands like Ray, Meow, Girlfriend Collective, Berries, Lovesick Plus, Eloquii, Gia IRL, and a lot more. Like, a whole lot. Actually, please list your fave small plus size brands below. I'm trying to do some birthday shopping research. There's obviously so much more nuance in regards to the history and length of plus size fashion that I could not possibly fit in this video, or else it would be hours long and I would go insane. But I highly encourage and recommend you all to check out the sources I used for this video, since there's so much more information in them, and again, this video literally would not exist without them. I have been planning this video for so long. I literally started the script for it last year, and then a series of unfortunate events happened, and it just kept getting delayed and delayed. So I'm really excited that you all finally get to see it, and I'm just really happy right now. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!